Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. This is the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to spread critical thinking, progressive politics, and left-wing philosophy. And I'm trying a little bit different thing with the intro this time. I know I sometimes talk with my hands, and then I bang the mic, and I'm usually just sitting, so all you see is from here up. But I thought I'd try this standing up thing that a lot of other people do. I don't know where they get the mics or what they're using for mics, but this is what I'm using right now. So this is episode or interview number, I think, 38. And this is with a person who contacted me by the name of Yanis Iqbal. And he's studied a lot about Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil. And I think his perspective on Jair matches probably most of the people who would be listening to this or watching this video. So I hope that you enjoy this content. I don't know Yanis super well, but I do know that, say, like, Bolsonaro is awful, and people who think that he's awful generally have a decent take on it. He's also written for a number of places with the intent to spread the word about the awful things that Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil. I know this was recorded quite a while ago, so I know that some of the content might not be as up to date as it should have been. I had a whole bunch of podcast interviews all at once. And then, of course, that means it takes 2 weeks for each episode to get it produced and published. And I've got, other things on the go as well. Just recently, I released the episode with Dietrich von Doom, and that episode was quite old at that point. And Yanis's interview came after that, and so then it's got to be 2 months, maybe even 2.5, 3 months old at this point. And I know Bolsonaro has been in and out of the hospital with COVID and what have you, other health issues. So I imagine that this conversation is probably, it doesn't cover a lot of the newer news regarding Bolsonaro. So I hope that's okay. And I guess before I get into before I send you over to the interview, which I think was really cool, it was a good interview. Yanis provided me with a lot of sources on his articles before I spoke to him, and so I had some background at least to work with, and of course I've read on Bolsonaro myself. Before I get into that interview, I've got to thank Jamie, my new patron, and I got to thank Justin for increasing his patron pledge. If you want to support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. Or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. Besides that, of course, sharing the show around, hitting the notification bell or whatever the fuck thing that you do, that would be great. Share it with people who might enjoy it as well. I would love to start building a community so that we can start doing something beyond just podcasting. But I think that's everything I've got for you today. Thanks so much for listening and watching. I hope that you enjoyed this interview, and see you next time. All right. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, a podcast that I use to spread critical thinking, progressive politics, and left-wing philosophy by talking to a variety of people. And today I'm talking to Yanis Iqbal. Is that correct?
Yes, it's correct.
All right. So, you've published a few articles in various places. Why don't you start off telling us a little bit about you and your work?
I entered the domain of leftist politics when I was introduced by my father to various books about Marxist theory, and since then it has been an explosive journey exploring the global south in particular and situating socialism within that region. So Brazil is part of that larger project. And this project, my personal project, involves studying the third world in its relation to the first world or the global north, and examining the internal class structures of these southern countries itself. So, Brazil forms a small part of this project, and since it has been experiencing many contradictions in the recent period, I have been studying it more thoroughly than other countries and have placed a special focus on this country.
Okay. So were you studying Brazil before Jair Bolsonaro came to power, or was this a more recent event, like, or you started looking at them?
When Jair Bolsonaro came to power, only then did I start studying Brazil, because Brazil came into political focus due to Bolsonaro's eccentric and aggressive behavior. And I
Right.
was intrigued by the superficial analysis of liberal media, so I tried to examine in more depth the phenomena represented by this person.
Yeah, it's it's interesting because even though often like the liberal media or they will frame him as a kind of a bad dude, like he's not doing his job the right way, or he's doing a bad job in the pandemic, and they'll report on the Amazon fire, rainforest selling off that stuff, but they won't like condemn it as they won't condemn it really. They'll just report on it.
Yes, you're correct. They don't highlight the capitalist nature of what is happening. They are just content to superficially state these facts and leave it to the reader to decide themselves. So, what I tried was to put all these facts into a political perspective, and that political perspective is socialism.
Yeah, I mean, the materialism that goes along with socialism, it makes sense to apply that filter, right?
Yes.
So you've got quite a list of things that we could talk about regarding Bolsonaro, but I wanna get your take first on how he came to power and the reaction of the Brazilian people.
He was initially an obscure parliamentarian and did not receive much focus, but things started to change when a imperialist campaign and a propaganda campaign was initiated against Lula and the Workers' Party, uh,
Mm.
which represent the leftist camp in Brazil. So, out of this contradictory reality, in which there were a number of forces, in which the leftist force was being suppressed, Lula was imprisoned so that he couldn't stand for elections. Bolsonaro emerged as an alternative, and from that point onwards, he foregrounded a neo-fascist project which involves neoliberalism and fascism, and it has been really disastrous for the Brazilian populace.
I know, like in terms of comparison to other leaders, like he was really compared to Donald Trump in a lot of ways. He apparently a fan of Donald Trump, but did he have that same populist messaging that Trump had?
Yes, we can call him a tropical Trump, as was said by many people, and this is because he too used a racist rhetoric against the indigenous people in Brazil, and he too used a xenophobic discourse to cover neoliberal policies of austerity and cuts to government budgets. So,
Mm.
speaking in terms of familiar resemblances, the class project and the political project represented by Bolsonaro and Trump was similar.
Okay. Yeah, it's I suppose in a lot of ways that's not that different from like the uh kind of centrist Democrat neoliberal project as well, but with, slightly more racism, I suppose.
Yes, centrism, you are correct. Centrism doesn't garnish itself with such racist statements. It uses a discourse of a really liberal national unity and fake democracy to implement these policies. And Bolsonaro made this discourse more exciting, and Trump did the same.
Yeah, yeah. People like that to see that veneer of, I guess, that veneer gone to some extent, which I guess makes sense for the appeal that they had. But okay, so when it comes to Bolsonaro, I heard some people making claims that he, like, I guess, how legitimate is his leadership or his presidency?
His presidency is not legitimate because we need to look at the events which preceded his election, and those events clearly indicate that the elections took place within certain restrictions imposed by the ruling elite of Brazil and also the ruling elite of USA. Um, Lula, who was um, projected to win the elections, was imprisoned,
Mm,
and this imprisonment ensured that Bolsonaro got elected. And we need to remember that the intervention of the U.S. State Department in this whole affair was very prominent, and this entire campaign was centered on an anti-corruption discourse, as is common in the in past history, because anti-socialist and anti-communist leaders frequently invoke a discourse of anti-corruption to malign leftist leaders, and this same happened in Brazil, where I think it was Lava Jato campaign, Operation Car Wash, which
right.
propelled Bolsonaro to popularity.
Yeah, like there was a propaganda campaign against Lula as well as the imprisonment, right?
Yes, there was a huge propaganda campaign, and we need to understand the fact that Lula's imprisonment was illegal. Um, in August 2018, the polls had registered that more than 20%, no, let's say 30% of the nation preferred Lula's Workers' Party, and the political parties that were spearheading an anti-PT campaign were rapidly declining in terms of their popularity. However, according to the Clean Record Act, which was ironically created under the Workers' Party administration itself, Lula would be ineligible for the 2018 elections. And this was used to justify his imprisonment and removal from the electoral process. And even the United Nations Human Rights Committee requested that Brazil's government not prevent Lula from standing for election in 2018 until
Hmm.
his appeals had been exhausted. But none of this had an impact on Brazilian politics, which was hell bent on putting Lula in jail. And we know that the judge Moro discussed the case with the lead prosecutor, to whom Moro gave advice about how to proceed with the case. So there was a structural bias in the entire judicial proceedings. The Operation Car Wash prosecutors plotted to use the investigation to undermine Lula in 2018 election. So judiciary and the ruling elite collaborated with each other to prevent Lula from winning the election.
So, how does Bolsonaro tie into those people that arranged it so that Lula couldn't win the election?
Okay. An important person in this entire affair is Judge Moro,
Okay.
who headed the campaign against Lula. In November 2018, Moro joined Jair Bolsonaro's government as his Minister of Justice, thus leaving no doubts about the political nature of the judicial proceedings against Lula. So I think that encapsulates and sums up what happened with the
Okay.
Workers' Party and how how Bolsonaro won the elections.
It's all very corrupt and crooked.
Yes, it's open corruption. There is no secrecy here.
So, I guess what are some of the things like in the list of things you've got to talk about regarding Bolsonaro? You've got the war against the indigenous people. I wonder if you can maybe lay out a little bit of that for us.
Indigenous people in Brazil experience a double oppression. both of capitalism and both of anti-indigenism. And Bolsonaro has intensified and, in fact, generated the latter tendency. In August 2020, the Brazilian Supreme Court ordered Bolsonaro to implement some measures aimed at protecting indigenous people from the raging pandemic. Um, and
Okay.
this ruling was the recognition of the totally disastrous policies of the Bolsonaro government. Indigenous Brazilians are dying at a higher rate than the general population, and it is estimated that they die of the virus twice as often as the non-indigenous people.
Mm.
And some communities are even on the verge of extermination due to coronavirus. And this crisis has been used by Bolsonaro to push an agenda of capitalism against the will of the indigenous people. Consultations with them and environmental impact assessments have been suspended in order to force through mega projects relating to agribusiness, infrastructure, dams, and mining. And under his administration, applications to mine on indigenous lands in Amazon have increased by more than 90%, and the
Okay.
number of invasions of indigenous areas have also increased. So these ecologically fragile areas are being informally colonized by the non-indigenous people under Bolsonaro.
Mm-hmm.
And the mining component of this entire program is extremely important. Through the fusion of anti-indigenous rhetoric and pro-mining policy, Bolsonaro has unleashed of informal war against the 900,000 indigenous people living in Brazil. He sent a bill to the Congress which would open Brazilian indigenous reserves to commercial mining and oil and gas exploration. And these projects have been, let's note, legally blocked under the country's 1988 constitution. And Bolsonaro's staunch and brutal opposition to indigenous people has not relented during the pandemic. He vetoed provisions of a law that required the government to provide disinfectants, drinking waters, and a guarantee of hospital beds to indigenous people amid the pandemic. And he also vetoed funding for the states and local governments with emergency plans for indigenous communities. And he denied indigenous people more information on coronavirus, including greater internet access. This indicates the hideous level of brutality which Bolsonaro government is practicing.
I wonder how much of that was, or was any of that in the, uh, even in the sightlines of the Brazilian government before Bolsonaro.
Uh, Before Bolsonaro, the protection of Amazon was emphasized, and policy of social welfare was pursued, which ensured that the marginalized groups did not feel left behind. And I agree that Lula wasn't a radical Marxist, he was a social democrat. But in the context of Brazil, it was radical. What is radical depends upon the material context of a country. So, what Lula did was beneficial for the indigenous people, but more could have been done in the urban areas regarding indigenous people, because
Mm.
the urban indigenous population, which constitutes half of the indigenous population, serves as a reserve army of labor for capitalism, which means that it functions as an additional pool of workers who depress wages. And this has resulted in high levels of inequalities in the form of informal employment and gender pay gap. So the rate of informal employment for indigenous women and men is much higher than non-indigenous women and men, and
Mm.
the earnings are also less than non-indigenous people. So this could have been eliminated, but Lula's government did not pursue robust policies towards this. But I have to say that he did try to create a better climate for indigenous people within Brazil, and given time, he would have tried to institute some measures to protect the urban indigenous population.
So there is a clear contrast between Lula and Bolsonaro in this area, because Lula actually was interested in helping the indigenous people in the conditions that they were living in, where Bolsonaro is actively making things worse.
Correct. And this was because due to the different social projects which both these leaders embody.
Right. There's a lot to unpack within that treatment of indigenous peoples, but there's also a lot of other things. What was Bolsonaro's reaction to the pandemic?
Bolsonaro's reaction to the pandemic has been cruel and at times comical because he himself has been fined for violating biosafety norms. The co- the COVID Performance Index, which is compiled by an institute, by the Lowy Institute, it ranks 98 countries handling of the COVID-19 outbreak, and Brazil performed the worst, occupying the last position. So, anti-science attitude and neoliberalism account for the country's dismal pandemic response. Ever since the first case of infection was diagnosed in February of 2020, Bolsonaro made anti-science statements regarding the pandemic, and he fudged data, changing the method of sharing information about the pandemic. So the judiciary had to intervene many a times to tell Bolsonaro that you need to be transparent about the pandemic. Infections in Brazil rose with the prevalence of the P1 variant, which is twice as transmissible as the pre-existing strains of COVID-19.
Right.
Instead of instituting strong measures aimed at breaking the chain of infection, Bolsonaro allowed the pandemic to run amok. And while the infection spread like wildfire, Bolsonaro remained in a state of delirium, endlessly ranting against lockdowns and curfews. He even went to the Supreme Court with an injunction to prohibit federal governors and mayors from deciding on lockdowns and curfews.
Wow.
And he has perceived the virus as a weapon created by China to gain advantages in the global market and expand communist domination. And this has um, resultantly created a strategy of herd immunity. So, to ensure that free market economy will keep working without any hassles, and internal enemies linked to international communism would also be defeated. And this has been interpreted as a war against communism rather than as a public health fight and a campaign against a lethal and uh, highly
Right.
transmissible virus.
Yeah, that sounds awfully familiar compared to like some of the rhetoric we hear now, like from right wingers in Canada and the United States, where it's like they still see the virus as this Chinese attack, basically. How many people in Brazil have actually, what do the numbers look like in Brazil for people who have died from the virus and people who have, I guess, what are their recovery situation like? Are they vaccinating?
While I don't have the current statistics about vaccination, um, I can say that the vaccination has moved at a slow pace because of the strange policies of the Bolsonaro government, which wants other kinds of treatments for the COVID-19 infection. So let me narrate to you an instance of this extremely foolish behavior.
Okay.
Minister of Health Pazuello received warnings at the end of December last year that oxygen supply shortages in Amazonas might occur by mid-January. He only acted when this deficiency inevitably led to numerous deaths in the capital city Manaus. Instead of oxygen, he sent thousands of doses of the anti-malaria drug chloroquine to Manaus, which has no proven efficacy against COVID-19. And the
Yeah.
situation in other areas is no better. There are reports of patients being tied up in order to be intubated for want of anesthetics. There are no anesthetics in Brazil right now. Hundreds
Wow.
have died on trolleys, hospital floors, or at homes. So, this is the reality, the ground reality of the pandemic in Brazil.
Lots of death and that's pretty brutal. That's not the kind of thing you would want to see from a uh, a reasonable government.
Yes, in times of pandemic, we need a reasonable and more importantly, a compassionate and sensitive government which
Yeah.
understands the needs of the people. But Bolsonaro doesn't represent any of these things. He is the cruel and, let's say, heartless person who only wants to strengthen his own personal power and the power of capital.
So what is this all translating to, like, in the current view of Bolsonaro by the Brazilian people?
Bolsonaro's policies are being increasingly resisted by the Brazilian populace, and they have been demanding the resignation of Bolsonaro. And this is an extremely important development because it conveys the fact that the left has potential in Brazil. It can regain power. Bolsonaro's anti-scientism and unmitigated neoliberalism have convinced the population that what they need is not right-wing fascist government like Bolsonaro. They want to return to the sensitive policies of Lula. And
Mm. Mhm.
opinion polls suggest that Lula is the best placed politician to challenge Bolsonaro in the 2022 elections. And at the same time, Bolsonaro is fast losing his appeal among the electorate. His disapproval rating hit a new high at 54%, and his approval rating has been hovering around 30%. He is no longer concerned with governing. Let's be clear about that. His sole focus is avoiding impeachment and making it to 2022 with at least some chance of making it to the second round of the presidential elections.
So we can kind of say for sure that Bolsonaro is just trying to hold on to power, but I wonder, like, what are some of the things that he does that demonstrate that he is instigating kind of a type of fascism?
So, Bolsonaro's policies reflect neo-fascism because, um, first of all, they have an anti-indigenous rhetoric, which is a, an ideological component of any fascist program. You need to identify an enemy. And in addition to the indigenous people, there have been many other enemies like communists, leftists, the Workers' Party in
Yeah.
particular. And in Brazil, Bolsonaro has carved neo-fascist dominance through what has been labeled as the Bull Bulletin Bible blog, which is a coalition based on connections with the agribusiness sector, military and police forces, and the evangelical religious right.
Okay.
And agribusiness interests have championed removing environmental restrictions and opening indigenous territory for sale and exploitation. And members of the Bullet Coalition promote deregulation in gun sales and fund Bolsonaro's campaign with money coming from the arms industry. And this also has a cultural function. A pro armament stance aims to symbolically convince Brazilian men that they are still strong because the economic disempowerment suffered by Brazilian men under neoliberalism is being stitched and healed through a hyper masculine code of violence. And this is also part of Bolsonaro's patriarchal politics. And
Mm-hmm.
close connections with armed forces have also allowed Bolsonaro to infuse emotive and emotional expressions into the criminal justice system. He has killed people wantonly in name of holding law and order and pursuing justice. And this was evident on May 6th of this year when the state police entered the favela of Jacarezinho in Rio de Janeiro and opened fire, killing more than 25 people who appeared to surrender even before the guns fired. And
Wow.
this appears to have been the deadliest such operation in more than a decade in Rio de Janeiro and furthers a long standing trend of unnecessary and disproportionate use of force by Brazil's police in the poor, marginalized, and predominantly Afro Brazilian neighborhoods.
What's the justification for the May 6th attack?
The justification was the general justification was the upholding of law and order, and it was also about partially about the drug war,
Oh,
which is
okay.
being practiced in many countries. Just see Duterte in Philippines, who is massacring people in name of this drug war. But more
Mm-hmm.
predominant was the emphasis on law and order.
Yeah, it always comes down to like law and order, like you say, it's a general thing, right? They can just say, oh, well, we uphold law and order. But then when it comes to the actual act of killing people, they always say, oh, well, they were breaking this law or they were breaking that law. And I guess like the drug war, like you say, it's all over the place in many countries, and it's a justification for a lot of injustice.
Correct. And it's politics of criminalization where some people are branded as criminals, not as humans who need to be reformed.
Right. Yeah. Like it's as though people who break the law are considered like less human than people who don't, right?
Correct.
So how does all this play in, like with Lula's acquittal? Like, was that just because it was a clearly unjust arrest or imprisonment?
Lula's acquittal, I think, is a major victory, and its impact is monumental. And this happened on March 8th of this year. The Supreme Federal Tribunal, which is Brazil's highest court, it struck down all criminal convictions against Lula, and we know that the imprisonment was unjust, and this was publicly acknowledged by the judiciary. So this also clears things for the Brazilian electorate,
Mm-hmm.
and this will be significant because it will convey to the Brazilian people that Bolsonaro's election was illegitimate, and that is why we are seeing a decline in the support base of Bolsonaro.
So when is the next opportunity for an election or what have you? And is there a chance that Bolsonaro is going to like try to assassinate Lula before this?
Bolsonaro may try anything because he's really desperate to hold on to power, and the contradictions of the ruling regime have been intensifying. Um, on 30 March of this year, the commanders of the Brazilian Army, Navy, and Air Force resigned from their posts in a historic move not seen since 1977 during the country's military dictatorship. And this turmoil in the Brazilian military is indicative of a general change in the political dynamics of the country after Lula was set free. The return of Lula has sent tremors through Bolsonaro's political camp. Dissenting groups within the ranks of the military have been encouraged by the anti-Bolsonaro sentiment caused by Lula's resurgence to resolve their contradictions with the ruling regime. And
Mm.
divisions within the military reflect growing cracks in Bolsonaro's fascist coalition. Efforts have been made to eliminate these internal weaknesses through a military reshuffle aimed at shoring up political support in Congress. So, this high level of desperation can lead to really turbulent and dangerous acts by Bolsonaro, and it will be more intense than what Trump tried to did in USA.
Right. So if the election comes along and Lula wins, then you think that Bolsonaro is going to try and rally his supporters to attempt a coup of some sort?
Um, Bolsonaro has already threatened to disregard the results of the 2022 elections.
Mm.
And in an allusion to the upcoming elections, in which Lula would be the winner, as all current polls predict, he said, "We are going to have problems." So that is a veiled threat that he is going to do something, and there can be not a coup, because I think there are cracks in the military, and the military does not wholeheartedly support Bolsonaro. There may be some reservoirs, some specific reservoirs of support within the military for this rightist camp, but the military as a whole doesn't support Bolsonaro. So I think what
Okay.
he will do is he will be denial of the results of the elections. He may try to rally the people, and this will result in a stalemate, which would have to be resolved through force, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully innocent people aren't hurt, but when people in power often they worry, they want to fight for their power, and often the people who get hurt are their supporters. So I don't predict, like, I don't think that it's, if he's going to fight against the election results, and even if the military isn't on his side, it could result in some harm being done to people. But One of the other things that you have here that we could talk about is the growth of patriarchal politics under the Bolsonaro regime. I know you mentioned like the attempt to make men feel strong, but how does that result uh, in the treatment of women? Like, what is the state of feminism, I guess, in Brazil?
The situation of women in Brazil has been horrendous, to say the least. After the election of Bolsonaro, there has been a systematic strangulation of feminist politics. In 2019, there was a 7.2% increase in femicide. And according to many organizations, during the COVID 19 pandemic, domestic violence has increased by more than 430%. So,
Wow.
Brazil's downward spiral into a patriarchal autocracy started after the parliamentary coup of 2016. In this coup, impeachment proceedings were initiated against the democratically elected leftist leader Dilma Rousseff due to an ostensible anti corruption campaign in which the US was secretly involved. And after this
Mhm.
coup, the PT was overthrown, and Michel Temer assumed the presidency of Brazil. And this was an interim presidency, and he appointed a cabinet composed only of white men who were responsible for a masculine witch hunt against Rousseff. And Jair Bolsonaro soon succeeded Temer's interim government and flagrantly reversed the historic reforms of the former PT government and installed a crony capitalist regime closely aligned with the national elites and anti feminist evangelic conservatives. Evangelic
Mm.
conservatives have perhaps played the most significant role in constituting a muscular matrix through which mass propagandist tactics, uh, which were clearly practiced during the election campaign of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has helped to materialize the misogynist demands of this evangelical bloc by abolishing the Department of Human Rights and replacing it with the conservative Department of Family Values. So, in a situation of far right machismo, one
Right.
is immediately reminded of the feminist history of Brazil's leftist era, which, while not perfect, was certainly better than what is happening now.
Right, right. Yeah, the replacement of a human rights council to with family values has some pretty big red flags there.
Yes, it legally establishes some cultural codes which oppress women, and this is closely related to the evangelical caucus or the Bancada Evangelica, which is a network of evangelical lawmakers with whom Bolsonaro consistently colludes to promote the collective aim of removing what they call a dangerous gender politics. So this misogynistic perspective and view will continue as long as this close relation between evangelists and the ascendance of the right exists in Brazil.
I know there was shortly after the election of Bolsonaro, I recall people being concerned that like university professors were going to start being arrested if they spoke out against Bolsonaro. I just recall that being a concern. I'm not sure. Did that ever come to fruition? Was that a concern that played out?
While I do not know about the arrest of academics, I can say that there has been an authoritarian witch hunt against many different communities, and this has included leftist uh, activists, and if this is including leftist activists, this will also include academics who are revolutionary in their orientation. So,
Mm.
while I do not know concrete examples, I can say that there may have been arrests of such individuals.
I mean, it's a common tactic, right, of authoritarian regimes to arrest everybody that they think is going to be a threat to their maintaining their power.
Yes, and I think Bolsonaro is borrowing these tactics quite intimately from the Modi regime in India. And
Mm-hmm.
the Modi regime has been extremely repressive. I live in India and I participated in the protests of 2020 against a citizenship law which discriminated and disenfranchised the Muslim population. So the mass arrests was daunting. You will inevitably feel intimidated. And this culture of fear is what Bolsonaro wants to replicate in Brazil.
Right, right. Yeah, it's I guess the power playbook for far right dictators is pretty much the same. They know what works, right?
Yes, they know what works because they take their inspiration from previous fascist leaders, and there is no doubt that all the contemporary neo-fascists follow the doctrines of Nazism in whatever obscure or um, unrecognizable form. It is ideologically similar, and in India the connection is more clear, but in Brazil it is hidden.
Right, right. Yeah, it's not there there's not like people actually promoting Nazism per se, but they're using fascist tactics and attacking indigenous peoples and people who aren't white, right?
Yes, correct. It's a loose correlation.
So we're coming up on 40-ish minutes. Is there anything you want to cover that we haven't covered?
No, I think we have covered all the topics.
All right. So where are your articles, or is there I mean, you have quite a list here of articles you've written. Are you all over the place? Do you have a social media presence?
Yes, I am on Twitter and on Facebook.
And what is your Twitter handle?
It's at Yanis Iqbal.
Okay. No, that's easy. Perfect. So I'll include links to all your articles in the show notes. And thank you for your time. This has been a really informative conversation.
Thank you. It was constructive discussing with you.
All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. I want to say thank you again to everyone who supports the show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many gig hours. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then you can check out the show notes or check my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people. From Many People's Strength, which is a show about Saskatchewan politics, and a new project I'm involved in that's called the Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries with my friend Damien Marie at Hope. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is the Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request, which is facebook.com/cjbrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which you can find on my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's just all try to be kind to other leftists and to all people, and even if we think they're wrong. The battle that we are fighting is an uphill one and has many obstacles, and we will need all the confidence we can